All right, so that was new, that was different. Please don't take the portion of what I gave you as a does he really think I need to remember that much? But welcome again to news. Just to give you some quick updates. It's now March. March 1st was the 100th anniversary of the March 1st movement, 1919, which is a very important holiday, not only for this nation, but also for believers. If you don't understand your history, I think there's something like 17 out of, 33? 33 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Christians, even when the nation itself was about 0.5% Christian. So in a time when the nation was not very Christian at all, Christian leaders were actually kind of at the forefront of Korea's independence. Aside from that, what else happened? This past Saturday, I spoke at the Cheonryung Ibu retreat. That's the young adults from age 25 to 35 plus. Yeah, I did it in Korean. Something like about 90-ish% Korean. This guy was there too. I don't know if anybody understood anything. It was really stressful. Honestly, I don't know why I did it. But yes, I survived. And actually, starting from this Friday, I'll be preaching in Korean every week to women. I don't know how this happened, but I'm overseeing 천장형 이교구 single, 주중 예배, which is basically married women who are 40 or younger, mostly with kids. So I am the women's ministry pastor of this church. If any women with kids have issues, I guess they need to come talk to me. Also today, actually, I'm going to get yelled at for making this public, but it's actually our anniversary. We were married on this day 1 year ago. Kind of crazy that it's already been a year, honestly. Time flies, but even in a very brief time, God can do a lot. And so I've been encouraged this year, and I know that there are many people going through other changes as well. And so just be encouraged that this next year for many of us is going to fly by. But I think we'll all have the opportunity to look back and see God's mercy and His grace during that time. With that, let's go ahead and start for today. And so we're continuing in the series in the book of James, and we're toward the latter part of chapter 4. And so the question I want to start off with today is, are you a planner? Are you a planner? Some of you are laughing at me, and I know why, because you guys are probably planned to laugh at me just now. But many of us there are those people that live and die by their schedule book, right? There are people that plan the next 5 years of their life, right? And then there are the exact opposite, people that live day to day, and whatever they feel like, all right, that's what I'm going to do. That's my sister, actually. So if you guys know Myers-Briggs, I am an ISTJ. I'm an ISTJ. So people don't think I'm an I. I'm a very weak I, but I am an I. But ST, whether sensing, thinking, judging, J is actually my strongest, which is why I was a good engineer. Okay? My sister is an ENFP. She is the exact opposite of me. I don't understand her, right? She's just whatever, she's this free spirit. But the weird thing is, even though we're complete different people, personality-wise, we actually understand each other's struggles with ministry. We're both pastors. She's actually a hospital chaplain. And so she actually really enjoys serving people that are really struggling, that are about to die. Right? Actually, I think her most favorite ward is the psych ward, for people that have mental disorders. She loves that stuff. I don't get her. But at the same time, I do get her. It's kind of weird. Regardless, I don't know why I got stuff on there. But let's go to James 4. Open your Bible, smartphones, or look at the screen. James 4, starting from verse 13. Where the Lord says this: Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. And so our theme for this year, 2019, is one of understanding the holiness of God and seeing that we are called to be holy just as God is holy. And so, actually, I appreciate that we've been singing Build My Life a lot, because that's really a lot of the heart of that song. But our hope and our desire for this year is learning what it means to live holier lives, to become more like God. Not in the sense that we're to be exalted, but to understand what is the heart and intention of God. And so we've been going through the book of James, we've been going through a lot, and most recently, starting from chapter 3, we focused a lot on the power of the tongue and on the need for godly wisdom, and then putting that together, understanding that pride itself is often the cause of sin. Our desire to boast of ourselves, our desire to look down upon others, is often what causes these conflicts with us. And so in that regards, James closes that middle part of chapter 4 by saying, use your tongue in a way that edifies others. Do not slander each other. And so on a similar vein, we're looking at two issues that actually have to deal with money. Now this has been a theme throughout the book is James talks about trials and suffering. He talks about wisdom, but now he's focusing his shift back on wealth. For those of you that have wealth, for those of you that have these means, how should you live in a way that glorifies the Lord? And actually, this passage is going to focus more on businessmen and merchants. The next one is actually going to focus more on landlords, people that own land and how they use that. And so I want you to understand that he's talking about specific issues, but at the same time, there are things we can learn generally from this. Okay? So, one thing to note for this next passage in chapter 4 as well as the beginning of chapter 5, rather than starting off with how he has been starting off with my brothers and sisters, he starts off with, now listen, right? You could actually say like, come on now, right? He's really trying to grab the attention of the people that he's writing to. And he's talking specifically about how they're using their wealth. And so here in this text, he's talking about people that are businessmen, they're merchants. They travel from country to country. You have to understand that this is in a time period where travel was not a simple thing, right? Today, we can get in a bus, we can get in a car, we can get in a train, a plane, a ship, right? There's so many ways to be transported safely and quickly. Back in those days, just going to the next city, you didn't know if you were going to come back alive, seriously, right? It could be a couple days trip to the next city. If you're going to another country, you would go on a boat, and that boat would take months to get there, right? So this was not a simple thing. But what business people did was very simple. They would go somewhere, they would buy products that were desirable somewhere else, and they would go to that place and sell it there for profit, right? Very simple concept. And then while they're there, they would find things that they could sell somewhere else, buy that, and take it somewhere else. And they would continue to make profit. Very simple concept, right? In actuality, my grandfather was a very successful businessman. He had originally wanted to become a pastor, but God closed that door. And so he's like, you know what? I will make money for the Lord. And he was a very, very successful businessman. He was actually the most wealthy person in his entire town. Right? So wealthy that when the Japanese left, after the Japanese occupation, he bought the Japanese guy's house. Right? Large house. Right? And so actually, I heard what he would do is he would drive all the way up to Seoul. My grandfather, like our family's from Hamgyong, which is a good like 4 or 5 hour drive. He would drive all the way up to Seoul. He would go and buy products from like Namdaemun, right? And it would be stuff that was coming from America. Back then, it was like nylons. Like Koreans had never seen nylons before, especially in the Shigor, like Hamgyong, right? And so he would go there and he would sell these nylons, and people would go like, oh, 너무 좋다. And then he would sell all these things. And then he would just continue to make a lot of money to the point where he was the wealthiest person in the entire town. And so this is what James is talking about. And he says, you know, you say you're going to do this and this. You're going to go to this country. You're going to have this business. And you're going to live this life. And James is really trying to check the attitude of those in position of influence. These are people who have wealth. These are people that can continue to make profit. And he's really checking the heart. And he says, you know what? You are nothing but a vanishing mist. Right? Or wisp, I think is what I titled the sermon today. You're nothing more than this little puff of moisture that disappears. That is what you are to the Lord. Right? You know, in many ways, this comes from things in the Old Testament. Hosea 13:3 says, therefore they will be like the morning mists, like the early dew that disappears, like chaff swirling through a threshing floor, like smoke escaping through a window. This is how fleeting human life is when you put it in perspective to an eternal God. And in many ways, this passage is very similar to what Jesus himself said in Luke 12, where he says, and he told them this parable, the ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. Right? Now, many times, I'm quoting a lot from Jesus himself because, as I said before, James was the brother of Jesus. And James, oftentimes, in his teaching in the book of James, is heavily influenced from what he heard from his older brother. And in a similar vein, when James is talking about this vanishing mist of how trivial our lives are unto the Lord, he's really questioning, what is your attitude? Going about making business, making these plans, and doing these things, that is what the world does. But what should you be doing? And he says, instead of making these plans, you should be saying, if it's the Lord's will, right? If this is what God desires. Now, a lot of times, like I've said to you guys in the past, the number one question that people ask me is, what is God's will for me? I don't know what to do in my life. Tell me. Right? And so, granted, I meet a lot of young people, so young people have this question, right? And James is really getting to this, and he says, you know what? You're living your life apart from God. But you should be asking yourself if it is the Lord's will. Now, as I was preparing this message, I was actually very challenged by one of the scholars I was reading from. It's from the Baker Exegetical Commentary. I forget the scholar's name, actually. But he really framed it in a different way that actually really questioned my understanding of the will of God. When we think of the will of God, we think of what's going to happen next. Right? God, what's next? Right? What am I supposed to do next? That's always our question. What is God's will for me? What is next? And that is part of it. Again, Matthew 6, Jesus himself says, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in the heavens. It's from the Lord's Prayer. Jesus himself is saying, thy will be done. Right? This is the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples, and it's for all of us, that as we pray to the Lord, we should always be praying that his will be done. But the thing that challenged me was that James wasn't so concerned about the functional will of God, like the chronological will of God, but he was more concerned about the ethical will of God. Why God desires these things? What is the heart of God behind these things? The ethical will of God. So this challenged me because oftentimes we always think of God's will as just what is going to happen. But when we actually ask the question about his ethical will, it's the why this is going to happen. The reason why this is brought up is because when you look at the last verse of this passage, it doesn't make sense if you're talking about the chronological will of God. It only makes sense if you're talking about the ethical will of God. I'll get to that a little bit later. So brothers and sisters, what is being transposed is living a life of faith versus one of independent autonomy. One where we're like, all right, God, this is what I'm going to do. This is my plan. I'm going to just run it by you. Just make it happen. Right? As I joked about last week, we look at oftentimes at God as someone who enables the things that we desire. Right? And I made that stupid analogy that God is like those little AI speakers, right? It's like, Hananim, yeah? And you just tell him what you want, right? But that's not who God is. God does not desire us to be autonomous and to live our lives simply just looking upon him, because if we live independently, that means we are living without faith in God. We're living in faith in ourselves. So this is what's being transposed. Do you live a life of faith, or are you just doing your own thing? Are you seeking the will of God, the heart of God? Or are you just doing whatever you desire to do? And he continues and says, as it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. So it's not just independence from God, but there is an arrogance in this independence. Look at what I'm doing. Look at what I'm capable of. That is one of the problems with success, brothers and sisters, is when we have great success, often we think we're the reason why. Myself personally, I've been doing ministry for some time, and honestly, I think one of the things that I'm most thankful for, as I really think about it now, is I'm kind of glad that God didn't give me great success early on. Right? I look at some of my fellow pastors who hit it big early on, and I look at them now and I'm like, early success is probably one of the things that really messes with your head. Especially as a pastor, right? You're doing these things and God is moving, people are becoming saved, the church is growing, and you're like, wow, patting myself on the back. I did a good job. Right? And then you look around and you're like, you know what? I know what's best, so people should listen to me. But that's actually the furthest thing from the truth. The reality is that when God works, it's because God is working, not because you're there. Right? You just happen to be part of it. You got a front seat ticket, right? That's all it is. But unfortunately, a lot of times when we are successful, we think it's us. Rather than giving glory back to God and thanking him for allowing us to be part of that glory, allowing us to partner with him in that. Now, it's not just ministry, honestly, brothers and sisters. Anything that we excel in, anything that we are excellent in, oftentimes, when we look at it as something that we did ourselves, we draw further and further away from God. And there's a reason why I believe Jesus says it's harder for a rich man to go to heaven than a camel through the needle of an eye. It's because any time when you have too much of anything, you start to think you don't need God. Right? Probably some of the most difficult people to minister to and the most difficult people to actually desire to come before God are people that are very wealthy. It's just truth. Right? And it's not just wealth. People that are good at anything, whether it's intellect, whether it's athletics, right? Whenever you're too good at anything, problems start to happen. Now, I'm not saying that God hasn't gifted you for a certain reason, but it's easier, much easier to fall apart from him when you focus more on what you can do. And so here James is attacking that arrogance. And he's attacking that boasting. And this is something that he was doing already, starting from chapter 3, when he was attacking the tongue because of its boasting. I think one of the things that's very clear in the book of James is arrogance, pride, is one of the things that we struggle most with as people. Jesus himself says in Matthew 6, do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring. Again, it's that attitude that we are not in control of our situation. Anything can happen. God alone is in control. God alone is the one above. So as I said before, brothers and sisters, independence is the opposite of faith. Independence is what makes us go further and further. And God just becomes that, that genie in the bottle. That person we go to when we need help. But not the person that we trust in. Now, honestly, for me, brothers and sisters, I think this has been one of the things that's been difficult for me growing up is I kind of grew up alone, right? I had family, I had sisters. My sisters were 4 and 3 years older than me. So it was very difficult for me to get close to my sisters. Plus, they hated me because I got all the love. Right? I was the only son, so I was obviously most loved. I was like the favorite nephew, right? My uncle who started this church, he would always bring me bags of chipo, right? The dried fish that I love so much. Like, I don't think he brought anything for my sisters. And then my grandparents were always talking about me, right? They basically helped raise me. They're always saying, you're going to be the next Hongmok Sang. They kept saying all these things to me. I was like the star child in the entire family, honestly. Not just within my brother, my sisters, but even my cousins kind of looked at me as the golden child of the family. Even now. But then my parents worked long hours. They would leave in the early morning because they ran a store, so they would go to these wholesale markets, buy cheap, they're businessmen, right? They would buy cheap things and sell them for a little bit more at their store. And so they would leave early in the morning and they wouldn't come back until about dinner time. So all day, I was basically home by myself, especially because my sisters were always ahead of me in school. Like when I was in middle school, my sisters were in high school. Right? So they're always at high school. I was at middle school. I would come home by myself, and we didn't have hot ones back then. Mm-hmm. Think about that, you middle schoolers. Life without hot one. When school ended, I went home. I didn't do my homework until my parents came home. So what did I do all day? I played. But here's the thing, is my sisters were off on their own, and I was basically by myself. And especially when I lived in Baltimore, before I moved to a nicer neighborhood, I lived in a dangerous area. So I didn't really play outside that much. I had a couple friends nearby, but I didn't go out that far because honestly it was really dangerous. So what did I do? I stayed home, and I drew pictures by myself. I like comics, so I made my own comic books. My mom threw those comics away, and I'm so sad. But regardless, I lived by myself. And because of this, I grew very independent. When I went into high school, my parents would buy a lot of frozen food. So that's how I started to bake. Because I didn't like the microwave, I would put them in the oven because it came out crispier, right? And so I would always bake food for myself when I got home. And so I was very independent. Later on, I go to college, and I was used to not seeing my parents, so the only time I got sad a little bit was during the holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas. And of course, I always went home then anyway. And then when I looked at, I used to be in charge of the phone bill when I was in college with my roommates. And so I knew how long each conversation was that we made, because I had to check, you owe this much, you owe this much. I always owed the least because my conversations were exactly 1 to 2 minutes. I would call my parents, and like, and then, thank you for calling, hang up. Like, seriously. There would be times I would even want to talk to them, and they're like already saying, thank you for calling, hang up. And I'm like, no! And so I realized later that this independence that I grew up with from my family and my parents actually really affected my relationship with God. Because I was used to not really, being in contact with my parents. In many ways, I was kind of not used to being in contact with God. I was like, okay, God, I'll see you at Christmas, right? And I'll see you at Jesus' birthday, right? And then I would just kind of live my life. And honestly, I still kind of struggle with this because this is how I was raised. But brothers and sisters, I'm bringing this illustration out because I want you to understand that the more independent we are from God, the more difficult it is for us to live a life of faith. So whatever you're doing, whether you're a student, whether you are in the workforce, right? Whatever you're doing, I really want you to ask this question: am I living my life day by faith? Or is God just kind of a footnote in my life? Right? Is he someone that I just kind of go to every now and then? Or is he really the one who I am trusting in? Is he really the one that I am seeking in all the things that I do? Now, James closes this passage by saying, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. This is the reason why I said this is the ethical will of God, because this is the last verse. If you don't read this verse as one that's, or if you read this verse in terms of God's will being the chronological will of God, this verse makes no sense. It's just random. But what James is really asking is, when he says, if it is the Lord's will, if that is God's desire, if that is God's heart, then this is how you should live. And then he brings it to a very general teaching, is that if you know that there is good that you are supposed to do, if God is giving you that conviction that this is something that you should be doing, then you should do it. This is what it means to live after God's will. Not asking God, what is next? No, it's asking God, God, what is your desire? What is your heart? What is the good in your heart that you desire me to live out right now? That is what it means to live by God's will. It is to live according to the heart of the Father. That he looks upon other people as he sees their needs and as he desires to do good things for them, it is for us to do likewise, to actually act it out in faith. So brothers and sisters, we are called to follow the ethical will of God in all areas of our lives. This is not just about our finances, right? Now, one of the things that challenges me about my grandfather, even though he was the wealthiest person in his hometown, he used that wealth to enable people. He built 5 churches. He literally laid the bricks himself. So it wasn't just him sending money. He literally put each brick down, right? That was the pride of my grandfather. And every pastor in that area knew if they needed financial backing, they could talk to him. So he used that money in a way that glorified the kingdom of God. He wasn't trying to save and accrue wealth. And I think this is something that has really bled into my family because we're horrible at finance. We're like, God gave you money? Yee! We're just like, throwing it around, right? And I'm sure that can be very frustrating for our wives. But that's the life that I've seen. Is that what God gives you, you can use to glorify God. And I saw that in my grandfather. I saw that in his latter lives on how he lived very humbly. And I see this even in other historical figures, like John Wesley. John Wesley, one of the things about him that always kind of challenged me was he always lived off of the same exact salary. So no matter how much money he made, he gave it all away except for this small amount that was just enough for him to live. That's not tithing. That's basically giving it all to God. Right? And so when I look at other people of faith, there's a challenge that God gives us things. Now this is not just wealth, right? A lot of us have abilities. A lot of us are good teachers at certain things. A lot of us have just a lot of different resources. You know, some of us are good cooks. Some of us are all these different things. We can bless so many people with the gifts that God has given us. And so, brothers and sisters, I challenge you in every area of your life to understand what is God's will for you, not what is next, but how does God desire to use you in that way. So as James, I think, was really getting the heart to is, life is not about making money. Right? Unfortunately, sometimes people get this confused. Now, there's a famous book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism by Max Weber. This is a long time ago. It's a very interesting study. If you actually look at history, wherever the Protestant church grows, there's economic growth. Right? Korea is a great example of this. When the church grew, the economy of Korea blew up. People were saying this was starting to happen in India. I don't know about right now, actually, my friend's an Indian missionary. But they were saying when the church was starting to grow in India, they were starting to see this happen as well. But I think, unfortunately, a lot of times, even though the Protestant, they actually, Max Weber's argument for why this is true is he believes the Protestant work ethic is the reason why capitalism grows. And you have to understand that the Catholic work ethic wasn't that great because they were trusting everything on the clergy. They're like, I don't have a relationship with God, but they do, so I'm going to wait for them. Right? Very similar to communism, where they're just like, those guys will figure it out, I'm just going to wait right here. Whereas the Protestant ethic is, I'm going to do this on my own, so I'm going to work hard, right? The Koreans love that Protestant work ethic. Like, honestly, why is the Presbyterian Church so big here? Because Koreans like to work hard. But regardless, one of the things I don't like about this trend is, even though there is truth to this, the problem that I see is capitalism starts to actually take control. So yes, the church helps kind of grow that economy, but unfortunately, the root of capitalism is about sin, right? It's greed. What drives capitalism is people that want to make money. And unfortunately, when that becomes the number one, the church actually gets influenced by it. So much so that John Piper actually wrote, "Brothers, we are not professionals." Right? Now this is a trend that was happening in the American church, that people were looking at CEOs and corporation structures and they're like, you know what? The church needs to learn from business. So we're going to run our churches like businesses. This killed the American church in many ways. Now, unfortunately, the Korean church followed the American church model, right? My uncle and other pastors went to America. They're like, Willow Creek, that's nice. Let's do this in Korea. And they went and they did it here in Korea, even better. But honestly, brothers and sisters, I think the Korean church needs to learn this too. That church is not a business. So brothers and sisters, to bring it all back, I want us to really ask ourselves, do I have the right attitude? Do I have the right perspective? Am I living my life asking God for His permission? You know, God, is this all right? Or am I actually seeking God in everything that I'm doing? Am I including God in everything I'm doing? Do I have the right attitude about how I'm living my life? About what I'm doing each and every day? That, brothers and sisters, is how we live according to His will. Not just about what is next, but why. Because, brothers and sisters, as the law says, the law tells us the heart of God, to love Him, and to love others. That is the heart of God. So in that way, brothers and sisters, our challenge is to follow not only His path, not only His direction, but His heart. So as you grow in your relationship with God, and as you learn God's heart for not just you, but for others, to live a life that reflects that, desires not only to follow His plan and His route, but to follow His heart and to become more like Him. Let's see some kind of prayer. We'll close for today. Brothers and sisters, I want us to really take a moment to just fix our eyes on God's heart. So first, let's take a time to reflect upon God's heart for us, how much He loves us. As we had communion, as we spent this time reflecting on what God has done for us, let's just look upon God and ask God, God, show me the heart that You have for me. Show me how much You love me. Show me how much You desire for me. To live according to Your Spirit, to live according to Your will. So let's take a moment to just reflect upon God's heart for us right now. Let's pray. as we look upon the love that God has for us, how He freely sent Jesus to die for our sins, to bring us into a relationship with Him, that as we look upon this God, that we would look at our lives and see, how does God